Hi, everyone. This is Andrew.
And this is Laura, and you are listening to the Sunday School Dropouts. Today is the last episode of our Touchstone topic series. Well, until we do another round, maybe later in the spring. But we're going to be talking today about the differences between therapy, coaching, and psychiatry. This is kind of a hot conversation in social media spaces, academics, and various state ethics boards. And I'm sure that both Andrew and I have a lot to say, namely because we are both educated as therapists. And we currently have licenses to practice or have had licenses to practice therapy, but we support people in the role of coaches as well. And to top it off, I have a PhD, which means I'm a doctor, but that doesn't actually mean I can prescribe medicine like a psychiatrist does. So we're going to talk about all of that and more, and why it's helpful in healing from religious trauma on today's episode. But first, I think we could maybe have a little flannel graph story time.
Let's do flannel graph story time. All right. So I feel like the subject matter I've been bringing to flannel graph story time has been heavy. And so, well, it's still heavy. So anyway, since that's that's
Basically,
the theme that I
yeah.
bring to the table.
I was going to say, as therapists, we do nothing light. We just always are deep in our feels all the time. Just kidding.
But like last time I think it was poetry I brought it's still, this is still literary in
Mhm.
content. Anyway, I'll there's backstory, but I'll just get to it. It's a book I'm currently rereading, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And
Mm.
yeah, it's
I think
okay.
I've
So
heard of that.
as one of my friends said, so eloquently put it, he's like, that book is fucking depressing. I can see why. I mean, are you familiar with the story at all?
I'm not. I don't think I've
Okay,
even heard
so
of it. Tell me.
yeah, it is one of his more famous books. The guy he has been around for a while. I think his first book was published in the 60s. So I don't know how old he is now. I think he's in his late
Mm.
80s or perhaps 90s. But it's so basically this story, The Road, it is a post-apocalyptic story of a father and son just trudging through the wasteland that is the American South and surviving. And yes, in the end, the
Interesting.
father does die, and so in that sense, yes, it's depressing. But it's but also then at the very end, there's some other survivors, folks that they run across that aren't dangerous, because they've run across for other folks who are not safe, who are dangerous, unsavory
Mhm.
characters. But then at the end, the boy, it does stumble across this other man who has a family, and they like take him in, and it ends bittersweet, I guess. Um, it's one of those stories where it's like it is dark, but I also feel like in spite of it, what it's highlighting is also like this innate good, even with all the shit, there's like
Mm.
still this innate goodness and humanity that's in the boy, the kid. And
Yes.
that's, even though this is the world he's coming up in, like there's still like goodness to be seen there. And I don't know, I like it.
I love
But
that.
this book also has a lot of meaning, because back when I was first starting to deconstruct but did not know that's what it was, this was in a time when I was still feeling like I needed to really be focusing my reading on, well, the Bible and stuff that point into the Bible, Christian writing, and more
Right. Right.
specifically Adventist writing. So Adventists are very,
Mhm.
very exclusivist. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, Adventist specific type writings. And so I remember that year, I still remember it was 2010. I got a Kindle for Christmas.
Mhm.
And I don't know if I had a coupon or what. I don't remember what prompted me to get this book. I had never read Cormac McCarthy before, but I
Mm.
just got this book, and I think I read it that afternoon in one sitting, and
Wow.
I loved it, and simultaneously felt incredibly guilty and shame that I was enjoying and spending time
Oh, it's
reading
such
this.
a heathen.
Yeah, exactly. Reading this thing that had, wasn't nurturing my spiritual life at all. And yet it was, just not in the way that my conservative Adventist self thought it should be.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, it's I want to say it's a good book. It's a great book. I realize it's not for everybody, so I don't expect everyone to go out and buy it, read it, and it resonate with them.
Mm.
But it's resonated a lot with me.
Mm.
through the years. And so, yeah, I reread it every now and then, and I'm rereading it currently. So it's,
I love
again,
it.
The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
Okay. Maybe have to add that one to my beach reads or something. Well,
Yeah.
I will go on the opposite side of things because, we were joking that, as therapists, we just are in our feels all day and, don't do anything light. And as an Enneagram 4, I'm like, yes, give me all the deep, dark sads, um, but, but actually, like, as I was thinking about like, oh, what are some of the things that are like influencing me? It's late summer as you guys are hearing this, which means Bachelor in Paradise is on, which is such wholesome TV. No, anyways, I'm a big fan, not for its cinematic quality, of The Bachelor, but it is actually for mental health reasons. Because, we, as we'll be talking about today, we're therapists, we are coaches, we are in the sludge a lot of times, all day, every day, which is an absolute honor. I love it. And also really heavy, and it can be really dark. And so somehow years ago, I kind of figured, maybe probably like accidentally figured out that Bachelor podcasts, because they are so meaningless and just filled with like fluff, were like really, really helpful during my days where I would see clients. And what I would do is I would, watch or, have a session, and then I'd turn a podcast on for like 10, 15 minutes or whatever. And because of like the content and it really being so meaningless, it like cleared my mind. It reminded me that, there's, this dark, heavy stuff that, we're kind of working through. And then it gave this, like really light, ridiculous perspectives on other things and on this show that is rather meaningless. And I'm certainly not promoting that you have to watch The Bachelor, because there's like so many problematic things with it. However, what I am promoting is this idea of the mixture of like heavy and light, and giving ourselves these moments of lightness. And that's been extremely important to me. And I actually miss it when like the Bachelor franchise doesn't have shows that are going on and there's no recap podcast, because I'll be like, well, what do I listen to? I don't want to like listen to a cult podcast or, things like that. So, anyways, so it is something that I've been, engaging with, as we're in Bachelor season and all the Bachelor shows are on and everything like that. And I actually thought I would just kind of share that. But the other piece of it is that it actually was very helpful in my own process of deconstruction years ago. When I was wrestling with the idea of like expanding what we call the window of tolerance. And that's like learning to sit with discomfort without being like becoming so activated that we're in those spaces of like fight or flight or freeze. And I noticed, because in fundamentalism, difference equals danger. And so sometimes even difference over like really meaningless things can still feel dangerous to our nervous system. And so I started doing this back in the days. They didn't even have podcasts yet. So I'd read Bachelor blogs. I'd go and I'd read them all. And I'd notice like people that were having different opinions would really activate me. And I was like, well, that's interesting, because this doesn't really mean anything to me. And yet I can notice that my body is doing this thing. And so I actually used the blogs and then eventually the podcast to give a different perspective that was different than my own, and learn how to tolerate what it felt like in my body, to sit with that difference and to be okay, and to not need them to agree, or to not need one person to be right or wrong over the other person. And interestingly, it really did grow my like window of tolerance, because then I was able to take that and apply it in like real life situations and situations that actually did matter. But it's funny that, yeah, I listen to all these ridiculous podcasts, and it's so helpful. So helpful. But I will say this, I had a hysterectomy several months ago. And I had a lot of time in bed where I wasn't watching TV. I wasn't like even reading books or anything like that. And I was like, well, I guess I'll listen to my Bachelor podcast. Oh my gosh, I hated them. They're so awful. Like the only reason I like them is like they provide a little space and I'm doing other things while I'm listening. So anyways, that's just my weird, like, kind of what I'm listening to right now in a probably very different thing than what most people would expect me to say.
No, I love it though. And honestly, it resonates so much when you're like, I don't want to listen to another cult podcast or something
Yeah.
like that. Cause it's like, I
Yeah.
do listen to that stuff a lot.
Hmm.
And I'm also
A
at a
lot.
place where
Yeah.
it's like, I also will feel my stomach turn if I get offered one more
Yes.
podcast breaking
Yeah.
down toxic high demand religion at a mega church. I'm like, I know they're all toxic. I know. I'm so beyond, I'm over it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
not even burned out. It's just I'm beyond that now. Like
Yeah.
I can
Hmm.
do it. I can
Hmm.
do other things because I enjoy them, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I love that. And honestly, and maybe, you know what? I'll save it for what I'm reclaiming. Um, I'll piggyback off of what I just said. But yes, and even what we just did there, we have the heavier stuff that Andrew's reading, and then my really ridiculous light stuff. So I think that's what makes for a good story time, though.
Yeah, you know, it does. It does. Having a mixture and a balance is good. I
I
think
love
so.
it. I love it. Well, this was a good one. All right. So, like we said at the beginning of the episode, today we are going to be talking about the difference between therapy, coaching, and psychiatry. So, I think that's probably going to be the best thing to start off with is just talking about that.
Mhm.
What is the difference? I know I get asked this question a lot on Instagram in particular, and
Mhm.
there's kind of some hot debate. Are coaches valid? Should we listen to therapists? Like, are they, are,
Mhm.
are they worth having in our lives? I have lots of opinions, I'm sure you do too. But yeah, so we're going to talk about that today, and we'll talk about how it pertains to religious trauma. So, Andrew, I'm going to put you on the spot. What would you say are some of the biggest differences between therapy, coaching, and psychiatry?
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, psychology is another one that gets thrown in there too, because people think
Yeah,
psychiatrists and psychologists are interchangeable a lot of times.
very true. Hmm.
Yes, the biggest difference is at just a superficial level, to be a coach, anybody can be a coach. There's no governing body with licensing and ethics boards and
Yep.
such. You can
Hmm.
call yourself a coach. You can legally do that. To be a therapist, to legally call yourself a therapist, you do need a license, and you will probably have at least a master's degree. Usually a therapist will
Hmm.
have master's level degrees, and there's
Hmm.
that includes social workers, clinical mental health counselors, and licensed marriage family therapists. So I think that's
Hmm.
the main three: social
Yeah.
workers, marriage family therapists, and counselors. Am I
Yep.
forgetting
Yeah.
somebody?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I think that depending on the state that you live in, the counselor piece kind of has some like different titles. So some people will be
Yes,
called like a mental health counselor, other people will be
correct. Yeah.
called licensed professional
Oh,
counselors. So
it's so
they're
confusing.
usually the same, but it's just the
Yes.
state calls them something different.
And there's, not to muddy the waters more, but there's also provisional license and full license. All that means
Hmm.
is if you are a provisional license, which will usually be denoted by the term associate somewhere in there, usually,
Hmm.
all that means is that the person is still working under supervision. After you
Hmm.
get your degree, apply for your provisional license in a state, you still have to work under a clinical supervisor for 2,000 to 3,000 hours, depending on the state specific
Yeah.
requirements. So that's all that means.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, it gets confusing because there's so many, like in Illinois, it was
Yeah.
LPC, LCPC. In North Carolina now, I think it's like else, like it's licensed like clinical
Yeah.
LCMH. I don't know. It's ridiculous.
NCHSP. Yeah.
It used to just be LPC, and now they decided, like, why not just double the length of this term? So,
And then a psychiatrist
mhm,
is a doctor
yep,
who has experience or knowledge of psychological medicine,
right,
essentially.
yep.
Psychological doctor, but not a psychologist.
Correct. And
Yes.
then yeah, and then with a psychologist, um, that they do have a doctorate degree.
Hmm.
I think they can work in a number of capacities. Some of them
Hmm.
do counseling, like
Hmm.
one-on-one therapy. A lot of them don't. A lot of the ones
Yeah.
I've known actually are doing more of like testing,
Hmm.
diagnostics. So for example, like the context that I would work with a psychologist in a school counseling setting was I would oftentimes have kids I worked with that were being referred to them to do batteries of
Hmm.
testing to see, are they on the spectrum? What's their like processing speed, cognitive abilities, ADHD or not, like to, rule out some things. Oftentimes it would be a psychologist who would be doing that testing. And then I guess the other piece that's important, because a lot of folks think that all of us prescribe medication, which is not true.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. The only people that prescribe medications would be a psychiatrist, or a psychiatric nurse practitioner can also do that
Mhm.
as well, but a therapist, a coach,
Yep.
and most psychologists cannot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then are there some states where psychologists can? I've heard that, but I honestly have
I
not
would have
known that firsthand to ever be true.
I would have to look that up. Some of the rules have changed. And again, there's like different states have different qualifications, but
Mhm.
I don't know if they can anymore.
Okay.
I have to be honest. I know that I okay, I don't want, I was gonna say I was gonna make a statement, but I actually don't know if that's true. So we're not
Yeah.
gonna say that.
Well, and to
But
be fair, I mean, all of these fields are the other thing too is these are on ever evolving fields. I feel like,
mhm, mhm,
for example, like I can speak to my degree. I can't speak for the other master's degrees, but for counseling, it used to be so there's a national accrediting body, KCREP,
mhm,
to
mhm,
be accredited. It used to be the program only needed to be like 40 something credit hours. Well, they upped that to like 60, and every few
mhm,
years they'll add some more mandatory classes, things like that.
mhm,
So just to speak to the ever evolving nature of the field, like things do change a lot.
mhm,
I think
mhm.
years ago you could be a practicing psychologist with only a master's degree.
Yes.
Now
Yes.
that is not true.
Mhm, mhm.
So not to invalidate
Yeah.
anybody who just has a master's in psychology, but you're not a psychologist. That means to say you're a
Yes.
psychologist is implying and saying that you are a board licensed psychologist. That implies
Yep.
you have a doctoral degree and have a license with the
Mhm,
state. And so therefore, if you don't
mhm.
have that doctoral degree and that license,
Yeah.
you are not actually that. So
Yeah.
there are some legal
Yep.
ramifications, just like,
Mhm,
for example, I do have my master's in counseling. I no longer hold a
mhm,
license. I work as a coach now.
mhm,
I cannot
mhm.
legally go out and market myself as a counselor. Yes, I have that
Right.
academic background. I've had licensure.
Mhm,
I don't currently. So
mhm,
ethically
mhm.
and legally, I could not say that I am one, and I don't say that I am one.
Yeah. There's a lot of differences for sure. And I think too, so we're talking, we have kind of this like academic background that we're talking about here of like, here's
Mhm.
kind of the schooling process for each different profession. But I think too, it's important to recognize, we're talking about the differences between therapy and coaching and psychiatry, psychology, what their purposes are in people's lives, so like
Mhm.
like Andrew was saying, with a psychologist, we're looking more at like assessments, diagnostics, testing, these sorts of things. With a psychiatrist, we're looking at medicine. With a therapist, we're looking at mental health issues. And with coaching, there's a whole lot of things we can be looking at within
Mhm.
that. Up until probably the last 5 to 10 years, most people think of coaching in terms of maybe like business coaching, life coaching, career coaching, where it's a very specific, kind of we talk about our goals and we work towards those goals. I think coaching can be an evolving field. And which is wonderful. There's a lot of perks of coaching. We'll talk about that in a second. And then, like Andrew is saying, there's also some potential downfalls in that coaching is an unregulated field, which means anybody can hang a shingle on their door and say, hang a shingle and say, I'm a coach, and I can help you with these things and you can pay me all this money. And, I'm selling this package or this program or this ideal or this whatever. And that can be highly misleading, highly unethical, but it also can be, like highly helpful too, and so,
Mhm.
um, yeah. So I know it's like probably as we're describing this, it feels maybe gray and fuzzy, and that's because it is. And so I just want to kind of like call that out. And maybe too, like it would be important to talk about why this, like even here at the beginning, like why is this important as
Mhm.
talking about religious trauma? Because we're calling this a touchstone topic, which means we
Mhm.
believe that it's important to address this right up front, like, what is the difference here? Because we are invested in supporting people in a way that feels really helpful. And I know for me personally, there's a lot of confusion. Not me personally, but like as I've worked with clients, there's a lot of confusion as to like what is the type of support that I should be going after. Do I need to work with a therapist? Could I work with a coach? Should I
Mhm.
be on medicine? Do I need to get tested for certain diagnoses or these sorts of things? And I think it's just really important, especially coming out of high control religion, where most of us were not only not encouraged to seek mental health support, but that was actually vilified,
Mhm.
demonized, or you could even get in trouble in some of these groups for seeking some of those outside resources and support. I know in contexts that I've been in personally, and as well as what I've heard from others, there was a lot of shaming and literal disconnection if you sought outside support from either like a mental health professional or a mental health professional who wasn't approved by the church. And so I think
Mhm.
for a lot of us coming out of these systems, there's very little knowledge as to what these different services provide and
Mhm.
where we can seek support, as well as some of our own kind of like internalized kind of like resistance towards receiving mental health support because of how ingrained it is in us that these are not services that we should have. This indicates maybe fault within us or deficiency within us. And so I think there actually is a larger conversation that should be had around mental health support and why it's so needed, specifically for those of us coming out of high control religions.
Yeah, I mean, these are extremely important conversations to have, and I think for
Mhm.
me, the biggest thing is just informed consent.
Mhm.
And language matters, and so I want folks to know what it is, at least like know what we're referring to when we say
Yeah.
like a therapist or a psychiatrist or it
Mhm.
or whatever, or a coach of some sort.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, and we can circle back to this, so just put a pin in
Mhm.
another term I think that's very important, that's very relevant to the folks listening, is going to be the idea of a Christian counselor slash pastoral counselor.
Oof, yeah.
That the whole nuance of, or the difference of, a counselor who happens to be a Christian and a Christian counselor as marketed on their,
Mhm.
website
Mhm.
or something. um
Mhm.
anyway, that's a whole other thing, but I know it's very relevant
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
folks deconstructing in
Yeah.
the midst of
Yeah.
high control religions.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe a good place to start then could be to, both of us, you've already talked a little bit about your background. We both are practicing as coaches. Like Andrew, I also have a background, like my academic background is in therapy. I have a degree in marriage and family therapy, which actually does not mean that I work with marriages or families. It's kind of the way that you conceptualize relationships and people. That's kind of I conceptualize them in a systemic way, meaning I see not one person as an individual, but as a part of a system. And so that's my background. I actually still do have a license, and in parts that is, well, not in part, it is fully because I'm also a licensure supervisor in the state of Tennessee, which means that I work with other people as they are getting their license in a training fashion to help them, learn to be really good therapists. And I love it. It is one of my favorite parts of my job, and it is solely the reason that I keep my license. So there's that piece of it. But then I also have a PhD, which does not mean I'm a psychologist, because that's not what my PhD is in. It does give me the title of doctor. But as it pertains to therapy and coaching, it kind of doesn't mean anything. So it's extra education, a whole lot more research and student debt. But it's definitely informed how I practice and the way I practice and who I work with. So that's my background a little bit, but I wonder if we should talk about why we practice as coaches
Hmm.
as opposed to therapists, even though we have a therapy background.
Hmm.
So I'm curious to know from you, Andrew, what is it that appeals to you, like coaching versus therapy? And maybe we can just start there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. um One of the reasons I really like what I do as a coach, as opposed to like a therapist or a counselor, is that I'm really able to focus much more on a wellness model rather than a medical model.
Mm, Mhm.
Now, what the hell does that mean? If you
Yes.
don't,
Yes.
so what I mean by that is, so a medical model. I'll start there because that is what most therapy is in, well, at least in the United States. Anything that's being
Yep.
reimbursed by insurance or Medicaid, and that is, a
Mhm.
medical model is, it's going to be more about symptom management. It's about pathology.
Mhm.
It's about what are you presenting with, like
Yes.
criteria. What is the diagnosis?
Mhm.
And how do we alleviate those symptoms in such a way where we can document and say that, okay, success by reduction of symptoms,
Mhm.
that's what we're,
Mhm.
and there you go. I feel like that's very limiting. I understand the purpose
Mhm.
behind it, but I think that's very limiting. um, I like
Mhm.
more of a wellness model, meaning
Mhm.
I don't look at what you're dealing with as a pathology that needs diagnosed. I don't look at it as there's
Mhm.
distressing things that are coming up that need to be managed and gotten rid of, whether that be depression,
Mhm.
anxiety, just to name a couple of common ones. um, I don't look at it that way.
Mhm.
And I know I've mentioned this before, I personally do an internal family systems model, which is can be used in therapy, and it is, but I very much don't look at people as a diagnosis, as
Yeah.
a collection of symptoms that need to be alleviated or lessened to be
Mhm.
successful.
Mhm.
um I also, I think diagnosis can be useful at times, and I also,
Yeah.
if possible, I'd like to see treatment not have to involve that, because it does become part of your
Mhm.
medical record, and depending on what
Mhm.
the diagnosis is, I mean,
Mhm.
it can be a barrier sometimes, depending on what your
Absolutely.
line of work is and what diagnosis we're talking about.
Mhm.
There are implications, especially with like the medication that maybe you're being prescribed as well. And I just, that's my main reason.
Yeah.
That's my initial reason. And then just
Mhm.
the flexibility of the freedom to work with folks across state lines, across international
Mhm.
lines.
Yes.
And I've already alluded to this, but not being obligated to give them a diagnosis to justify
Mhm.
treatment. That's the other piece that
Mhm.
because I think people deserve services like this without
Mhm.
needing to be labeled with a diagnostic code
Right.
to
Yeah. Yeah.
justify it. And yet the reality is, if
Mhm.
a third party payer is going to reimburse, they want the code, they want
Yeah.
a diagnosis, and
Mhm.
that's an unfortunate aspect.
Like, I mean, I could say like ditto to all of that. And so when Andrew's talking about the medical model, that would be something that therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists are all kind of under that umbrella of what this medical model is. And that's not to say that any of those professions couldn't like personally lean towards a more wellness model instead of a medical model. But traditionally, as therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists are trained, they're trained with that model in mind. Um, when we look at some of the other maybe more progressive or newer research models of, I'm not even going to say therapy, just like trauma informed and trauma trained interventions and resolution models, they actually don't fit under the medical model. And in part, that's because they are available to non-educated, non-therapy educated people or non-medical educated people. And what that means is like, for instance, I'm trained in somatic experiencing, which is a 3-year training. It's very time consuming and very, like very extensive, right? But my cohort of people, I had nurses, I had massage therapists, coaches, therapists, doctors, teachers, hairdressers, bartenders, who are going, I realize that I come in contact with people every day and I want more skills to be able to work with them in the context that I'm working in. And I really appreciate that about the coaching piece, and really where some of these trauma resolution models are going. Internal family systems is another one where they're saying, hey, here's some really great resources, tools, and interventions. We don't believe that this should be made available only exclusively to somebody who has a master's degree in a therapeutic field. We know that these skills can be learned by anybody and used in really effective ways. So I know that's been really helpful, as somebody who is a coach looking at, we now have a lot more resources available to us. And, one of the things that Andrew talked about, and this is actually, I would say, the downfall to coaching that is something that I actually appreciate about therapy is therapy does have credentialing boards, or oversight boards. We might call them ethical boards, and they can be a pain to deal with for sure. However, there is an aspect of safety, client safety, that these ethical boards can help with, in that there's accountability and integrity with which providers need to operate under. So when I got my license as a licensed marriage and family therapist, I was agreeing to a code of ethics, and saying, hey, I'm not going to have dual relationships. I'm not going to have sexual relationships with my clients. I'm not going to use my power to, manipulate or coerce or things like that. And by agreeing to that, my client then has permission and privileges to be able to be protected if I did engage in any of those behaviors. And that could mean a variety of different consequences or punishments, including my license being revoked, if I were to do those things and the board were to investigate that and pursue consequence. And so there is that. I don't say that as like, so therapists should just, you should be a therapist so that you can be punished. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But I do see that being a positive, in that it offers a bit more accountability and potential for safety for the client that coaching cannot offer, because there is not an oversight board. There are some consortiums that have that you can join that kind of have some of their own codes of ethics. The problem is they're not enforceable. The only thing that's going to happen is you're not going to be able to be a part of that kind of group of coaches. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not going to impact your paycheck. It's not going to impact, how you work with clients. And so, there's pluses and minuses to the ethical board, but in terms of client safety, that's the one thing that I think therapy, psychiatry, and psychology does have in its corner that is not in coaching, and truly probably will not be in the coaching field for another 30 to 40 years. At least that's kind of what I'm hearing from some of the higher ups in different ethical, on boards and stuff in different fields. So that I think is important to recognize that, because we're certainly not wanting to knock coaching or therapy or psychiatry. Everybody's going to be different in terms of what works for them and what is beneficial, what they can afford, what's in their area, all these things. But I think it's important to know, hey, there are risks. There's risks to seeing a coach over a therapist, for ethical and accountability reasons, as well as other things too, which we can get to. But yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of look at what are some of the differences in positives, negatives of these fields, for sure.
That I think is very important. And just tying into what I said earlier about informed consent, it's not that I think, I am a coach, so obviously I don't think that coaching is harmful or unethical. I know there's some therapists who basically feel it is, or has the potential to be, because it does have the potential to be. And like you said, there is one less safety net. But I think that's where, what I've always told folks, because when I was still actively working as a therapist, I would have people ask me what's your opinion on coaching? Because I'm thinking about seeing this coach and I don't know if I should. And honestly, I think that's fine. What I do say is just ask questions and see how they answer you. There's nothing wrong with coaching, but are they being honest about what their background is? Are they being honest about what their background isn't? What are they presenting as? What are they saying they can do and that they specialize in? For example, I had a friend who was going to work with a trauma coach. I told them to ask some of these questions, and they did, and they never really got an answer. And the person just kind of got defensive and mad at them, or not mad, but kind of, okay, well, that's a red flag. If they're not willing to just it's okay that you don't have a master's degree. It really is, but just be honest up front that you don't. Be honest that I do not have an academic background in clinical counseling or marriage, family, or whatever. My modalities are this, and this is what I bring to the table. Again, informed consent. It's not that means you can't work as a coach and aren't maybe an amazing practitioner. It's just be transparent, be honest. Folks deserve to know what they are or are not getting, and what you can and cannot offer. And, that's my big piece.
So I really appreciate that story you're sharing, because I think it brings up such a good point with coaches. And I know you said it at the beginning of the episode that, basically anybody can be a coach. And that's true, right? Anybody can say, I have this passion, I've had this experience. There's many coaches that say, oh, because I've experienced X, Y, and Z, I can now be a coach for people who are experiencing the same.
Mhm.
And so I'm just curious to have a conversation a little bit about like what would make a good coach. Like, we've talked a little bit about why we practice coaching over therapy, and we have some reasons like the medical model versus a wellness model, the accessibility of coaching versus sometimes the inaccessibility of therapy. We've got some great pros and cons. And again, not to we're not trying to like promote one over the other, because everything's going to work differently. But if we were to just talk about like the qualifications of a coach, because I think that is where the harm can happen, is to say, like, how do we determine if a coach is is a good fit for us, and maybe even should be helping us, especially when it comes to trauma and religious trauma? Because full disclosure, we practice as coaches for a company that specializes in religious trauma resolution and recovery. So what makes us qualified? Like, why should somebody come to us, right? And so I think let's talk about that. Why is this important? Why could we offer support?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of ways I could answer that or approach that question. Because yeah, on the one hand, from a legal perspective, well, anybody can say that that's what they do, that they're a
Mm-hmm.
coach and this is what they specialize in. Um, I I do think lived experience is important. Not to say that you
Sure.
can't effectively work with trauma if you've never experienced it. I don't think that's inherently
Mm-hmm.
true. I think one of the things that is, as I'm thinking about this, that's pretty important is, what kind of work have you done yourself? I would,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would even, without, asking someone to like divulge too much personally, I don't think that's an unfair question to ask,
Yeah.
like your therapist or your coach. Like, do you go to therapy? Do you do your own
Mm-hmm.
or coaching or whatever? Of just folks that like I know that have done, whether
Mm-hmm.
they're doing coaching or therapy. And it's funny that, sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's kind of ties back and is related. I remember my first year in grad school, I had a therapist, adjunct professor, but a therapist as well. And he just said at the very beginning, he's like, a lot of folks do grad school to be therapists, not because they're going to be good therapists, but because they need
Mm-hmm.
therapy. And
Yeah, I've
so,
heard that too.
not to knock anybody, I think a lot of folks could benefit greatly from it. It's not that there's anything wrong with you. It's just that we have these blind spots. We have these things that we aren't
Yeah.
able to see and recognize. We have, for example, like, okay, so you want to work with trauma. So you want to help people regain this ability to find that internal safety, to help regulate and show
Mhm.
up in their bodies. But if you can't even do that yourself on a personal level,
Yeah. Yeah.
I, that's the part where I would be concerned. Uh,
Mhm.
just speaking on a personal professional level to other professionals, it's
Yeah.
like that's just the importance of doing your own work.
Mhm.
But I know the original question was about qualifications. um
Mhm.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
curious what your thoughts are on that, because it's kind of one of those things where there's not like an official licensing board for coaches. You're right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, you said what is the work that they've done, and I would expand that from personal and professional. Just because you're a therapist does not make you uniquely or specifically qualified to work with trauma, or just because you're a coach doesn't mean that you can't. And so I am somebody who deeply values education. Obviously, I've gone to school for like a million years, so like I deeply value that. I deeply value trainings and certifications, and of course, I deeply value client safety. And so again, just having the title therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist does not guarantee that. It does not guarantee competency. It
mhm.
does not guarantee education of like really knowing about certain issues. So I think, it's possible to have somebody with a million years of education like myself, and they're still kind of an idiot when it comes to like actually working with people, or not being able to like work with them in a way that is effective. But when we talk about trauma coaching, because that is what we do,
Mhm.
um, I would be interested to see like what is your approach to this? So are you simply just calling yourself a coach, or have you gone and gotten some certifications or education? Like I said, I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner. I've spent 3 years spending my own time and my own money getting this certification because I believe that it's an effective way to work on resolving trauma. And I'm certainly not saying that somatic experiencing is the best or the only way to do it. And there's many other
Mhm.
wonderful trainings, but I would be curious to know, like, is this a coach who is pursuing, you know, trauma resolution modalities by, well-known, or I don't mean like popular, but like that have some credibility behind them.
Mhm.
I would be curious to know about that. I would be curious to know about people's like how they view, like, what does it mean to be trauma informed? Are
Mhm.
they somebody who is trauma informed, but maybe they're not trauma trained? The difference between those, is huge, right? Are they somebody who is prepared to work with somebody, who is highly activated in a session? Do they know how to
Mhm.
provide a sense of safety and get that person back into their body, versus sending them out into the world as, feeling kind of raw and open and exposed because of the things that we've talked about? I can think of many therapists who can understand trauma on a very cognitive level and do an immense amount of damage to their clients because they have them kind of open up, and then they don't know how to actually help their client navigate through something. And so the client is walking through the world as one giant trigger. I have clients that I work with where the therapist has done so much damage because they're not trained to understand the nervous system and activation and helping a client contain what
Mhm.
that is. And so I guess as it pertains to trauma coaching, I would be curious to know from that person, like, how do they work with trauma? How do they work with clients who get activated? Are they trained in different skills
Mhm.
and techniques that help a client uh, not only initially have develop a sense of internal safety, but that can do that if they become, thrown out of their window of tolerance or
Mhm.
activated to a point where things are overwhelming? I would be curious to know more about that. And yes, certifications and classes and education are I think can be extremely helpful, and they're not the only thing.
Right. Yeah, it's funny as you're saying this, I'm actually thinking we ought to make this a list and make it like just make a short list of like some good questions to ask. Because I also know
Mhm.
I've had conversations like this with folks, like friends even, like they're like, how do I know if this coach or therapist
Yeah.
is worth working with? Are they going to
Hmm.
be good? And I'll rattle off a bunch of
Hmm.
questions and they're just like, I don't
Hmm.
understand half of
Yeah.
the nuance of what you just said. They're like,
Yeah.
like I know it, I totally understand it all because that's what I do. But like
Hmm.
internal safety,
Hmm.
what like trauma trained, trauma informed, like, wait, say that again. What do
Hmm.
you mean by that?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
but I think it maybe really making a short list that people could just take like half a dozen questions that are good questions to kind of,
Hmm.
because again, that informed consent piece, just
Hmm.
understanding folks' backgrounds, their limitations,
Hmm.
what have they done
Yeah.
or haven't done, I think is so important. And this is not to undermine the field of therapy as a whole, but like, I said like my degree was 60 some credit hours.
Hmm.
There was not a single required class on trauma anything.
Right.
There
Right.
were a
Yeah.
couple, there were a couple electives.
Hmm.
I think one was on EMDR, which is great, but that's just one of several modalities that's
Hmm.
trauma that
Hmm.
that's trauma specific, right?
Hmm.
But it was not required. And
Yeah.
so, you can have licensed therapists that are, I'm sure they're still
Yeah.
good therapists, but
Yeah.
are not trauma trained in the least. And
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, shameless plug. I actually do have a little PDF on my website. I think it's like
mm,
$3 of like questions that you can ask somebody, a coach or a therapist, as well as the differences between coaching and therapy that specifically are talking about this, specifically talking about like, ask some of these questions,
mhm,
and here's things to look for. There was something you said that kind of was kind of triggering something too for me, triggering not in a bad way. But I think this is extremely important for coaches. I know this is drilled into therapists, but not so much coaches because there isn't like a formalized training. But if somebody can articulate what their limitations are, like their limitations around their scope of practice. So scope of practice is like, what am
mhm,
I
mhm,
qualified and trained in to be able to offer people, which is great to know that. And it's also almost even more important to know where the limitations are around
Mhm.
that. And so I'm making sure as a practitioner that I am not going past what I should be offering clients because I'm not trained in that, or I don't know how to do those things, because that is where we put clients in danger. And so
Mhm.
having somebody who can articulate, here's where my limitations are, here's where I would need to reach out for other support or refer out for other support is
Yeah.
extremely, extremely important. And there's many wonderful coaches and therapists that do know that. And I would say that is something that can actually really help build a sense of trust
Mhm.
among like between the practitioner and the client. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
agree.
I think that's important. What would be your, I think maybe a question or a conversation around, I have heard so many people who part of the appeal to our company, Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, is all of our practitioners are very well versed not only in trauma but also the religious trauma piece of it from our own
Mhm.
experiences as humans, as well as then really diving deeper into this. you know I'm I love that we can offer that, but I also know that that's not common, and given a variety of factors, that's also not accessible to some people.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious to know, like, in order to heal from religious trauma, like, do you have to have a religious trauma coach or a religious trauma therapist, or could you go to anybody?
Theoretically, you should be able to go to a therapist who's just very well trauma informed and trauma trained, because
Agreed.
religious trauma
Agreed.
is
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that it's one of those things where, not trying to sound overly critical of the clinicians, but when that doesn't work out, you're going for
Yeah.
trauma therapy and it's religious trauma and it's just hitting a dead end, things aren't resonating, things aren't clicking, the person's not, the clinician's just not
Hmm.
seeing you, they're just not getting
Hmm.
it. I I think that speaks more to their limitations, to be perfectly honest, than it does to, oh, you chose the wrong trauma therapist. Because I do think that if
Yeah.
they're truly trauma informed and trauma trained, it should
Hmm.
still be effective. Understanding how trauma shows up in the body, understanding
Yeah.
physiologically what's happening, like
Hmm.
we've talked about before. So, but that
Hmm.
being said, I do think there is an extra level of rapport that is built that can be very helpful, because I do think
Yeah.
that relationship is, and having that is important and very helpful. Working with
Hmm.
someone who does have a certain level of a shared
Yeah.
experience, whether it's the same denomination specifically or not,
Hmm.
but but I do think having
Yeah.
a little bit of shared background, it can be really helpful when, it's like, from a cultural perspective, you're working with someone who already kind of knows your language of origin, so to speak.
Hmm. Yeah.
That can be very validating.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think too, okay, so, and this is maybe part of a different conversation. One of the benefits for therapy is the insurance piece of it, that the
Mhm.
fact that many people do have insurance companies that will take or that will pay for part or all of therapy. And with that, I mean, that's really awesome, but that also can come with some, you may not have as much variety of who to choose from, which would then potentially include people who maybe aren't what Andrew is describing, like having some sort of at least a general knowledge of what is religious trauma. So that's there's a benefit and right benefit and a pro and con, but I think the other piece is that if you, let's say, you're going to somebody that takes your insurance and maybe they're not trained in religious trauma, which is probably common. There's not a ton of us out there. But if they are open in the sense that they're not dismissing your experience as just a bad church experience, or that they're not letting their own beliefs get in the way, perhaps they are a person of a specific faith or whatever, and that they're not bringing their own biases, their own morals, their own values into that process, that can also be really helpful, even if you can't find somebody who is specifically trained in religious trauma or has
Mhm.
a knowledge of your specific church or denomination or faith background or whatever. Like, are they somebody who will say, yes, religious trauma is trauma, or what you experienced was that bad. It was abuse. It's not just sinful people being sinners, but God is perfect, but that there would be an openness to not only accepting what you're talking about and really viewing it with validity, but that perhaps they would even go and educate themselves,
Yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
say, hey, I've got to figure this out. I remember one of the coolest, one of the therapists that I worked with, like such a cool moment was, she didn't have a background in religion. And I was the first person she had worked with that had experienced religious trauma. And she really took it upon herself to become educated in not only my religion of origin, but just understanding dynamics of power and control and narcissistic abuse, and really truly how religious trauma is trauma. And there are many therapists and coaches and people in supportive roles that will absolutely do that. And I would say,
Mhm.
so even if you can't find somebody in your area or in your insurance panel or whatever that isn't specifically trained, or is specifically trained in religious trauma, that could be the next best thing, if somebody who's open and who's validating and willing to learn.
Yeah, I think that just being open, willing to learn
Mhm,
is so huge because,
mhm,
and this goes for any marginalized identity that a therapist is working with. It's like, it's okay if
mhm,
you encounter a client that is beyond your scope of practice and expertise. Depending on how far outside of that, perhaps you do need to refer to someone else.
mhm,
But also, if it's like you don't understand where they're coming from, but you want to. And so
mhm.
them showing not just curiosity, but even like some of that initiative to educate
Yeah.
themselves too, because
Mhm, mhm.
I'm not totally trying to say like a therapist has to go out and do a whole research project, but at the same time, it's like they can be curious, but also never lift a
Right.
finger to educate themselves. And then that can also just become another
Mhm,
burden on the client where it's like,
mhm,
are you
mhm.
just using the client for like your own
Yeah,
free education? Like, oh, I
yeah,
don't understand this. Tell me all about it.
yeah,
But
yeah.
suddenly it's like, suddenly that's created an interesting dynamic, which
Mm,
I mean, there has to be a certain level of that, I realize, but I just know how
mhm.
burdensome that can be for someone
Yeah,
who already
yeah.
is. I'm just trying to resolve my
Mhm.
trauma. I really don't have time to educate you on all the nuance of Seventh Day Adventism, for example.
Yeah,
For me,
right, right. Yeah,
um, yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
Anyway, just some thoughts.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about like why somebody might choose therapy over coaching or coaching over therapy. And just, what some of the benefits, or like we've been saying, pros and cons of those would be. Like, why might we choose a therapist over a coach? What do you think?
Yeah. I think from sometimes insurance is coverage is a very big one.
Yes.
That's a very pragmatic
Mm-hmm.
one.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I do think sometimes using the framework of diagnosis is helpful. And I'll just speak anecdotally from my own
Mm-hmm.
personal experience. Like I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. Now the
Mm-hmm.
therapist could not prescribe anything, but and this may lead us into another question, but I did work with a therapist who specialized in ADHD in adults and
Yeah.
also had a psychiatrist. And so I did the two in
Mm-hmm.
conjunction with one another. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a case where that at that time in my life, having that framework, that structure, that very intentional focal point
Mm-hmm.
was extremely helpful, very useful.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, could a coach have helped me in that? Yeah, probably. But I did want somebody who was very specifically operating with
Yeah.
that diagnostic criteria in
Mm-hmm.
mind and that framework in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say too, sometimes, so when we talk about coaching, so we've kind of loosely talked around, coaches don't necessarily have to have certifications or training or those sorts of things. And so I think that's where, there may be more flexibility in the therapeutic world to say, hey, this is somebody who is versed in dealing with some very specific mental health issues or diagnoses that might not be suited for a coaching environment. I'm thinking, things like if there's like active like suicidal or homicidal ideations, therapy may be a better space for that. If there is some psychopathy or some diagnoses that are maybe not, I don't not as common, or maybe a little bit more specific, there may be some a more robust set of resources, in a therapeutic space. So I think that's important to recognize. I know for the Center of Trauma Resolution and Recovery, when we're very aware of what our scope of practice is, we do online sessions only, and there are clients of ours who definitely need more like individualized face-to-face support. We can't offer that at CTRR. And so that would be a perfect opportunity to, involve a therapist. I also think about situations like relationships where there is abuse and violence going on, like actively in a relationship. Those are often situations where a therapist may be better suited because they are there in your state. There's resources, emergency services, things like that. That is not to say that a coach could not deal with that, but sometimes when we're looking at some of those more volatile situations, therapy may be a better suited atmosphere for that. But what about coaching? Like when do you think coaching might be a better fit over therapy?
Well, to echo what you just said, because I've described sometimes like the need for therapy as opposed to coaching kind of being like it depends on the level of acuity. So the seriousness when it comes to safety, crisis, whether one's in crisis or not, that sort of thing. So just to say that, I agree with all of that. In terms of coaching, though, I think some of the things that can make it like times that it would be beneficial to seek out coaching are when the things that you are wanting to work on are things more like, well, faith deconstruction, which kind of starts out as maybe a little more cognitive of a thing. Yeah, but yes, it also unlocks a lot of other things. Like, as we know, it brings up lots of other things like different types, like trauma, perhaps things. But again, that kind of still tied into that last piece. When that level of acuity is a little bit lower and you are in a little bit of a safer space to start really exploring and unpacking some of these other things. I'm speaking in very, very much in generalities, but that is when I feel coaching would be more appropriate. Generally speaking, when that level of acuity is lower and you are in a safer space, but both physically, literally in your environment, but also internally as well.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the things that you've said a few times is like the difference between the medical model versus the wellness model. Sometimes the diagnosis is incredibly important. I thought your example of ADHD is extremely poignant in this conversation. I think when we don't need a diagnosis necessarily, right? Like, you don't have to have a diagnosis of PTSD or CPTSD to understand that you've experienced trauma, right? Like when we don't have to use a diagnosis as a way to kind of color the treatment that we're engaging in, I think coaching could be really, really helpful. So to say like, there's symptoms of trauma and these sorts of things. I don't need a specific diagnosis. And yet here's this person who is trauma trained in some different modalities, who understands like my specific trauma. I think that could be actually a really good pairing, so long as we are safe, and I can only speak for our company in that we highly prioritize safety, everything from like the way that we have designed like the forms and the information that you give us and like these sorts of things, as well as making sure that our practitioners do have training and are seeking out more education and understanding, the unique pieces of religious trauma and high control religion, cults, narcissistic abuse, and those sorts of things. And so we can only speak from our perspectives, but I think, those can be some reasons where coaching may be a better choice. And then kind of one of the practical things is, just like accessibility. I think about some of the first coaching clients that I ever had were from different countries. And part of the reason that they came to see me was because they literally could not find somebody in their country who understood what they were dealing with. And so because coaching is not limited, like who your clients is not limited to the state that you live in, which is a limitation of therapy and psychiatry and psychology. Because coaching does not have those parameters, there is more accessibility. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I love about CTRR is that we have clients, I think, from every continent in the world, which is
Yeah.
incredible. And I think it shows like how far reaching the problems are with like religion and how that impacts people and cults and all these things. But also like how incredible that there's a resource now. Like they go, I remember like meeting with a client who lives in a country that is primarily like affiliated with the Muslim faith. And they were like, there is no way I can find a therapist to talk about this because it literally would not be safe for me to do so. But now I can connect to this coach who understands not only the ins and outs of my faith, but can help me navigate this in a safe way where
Mhm.
I don't have to be worried about like being turned in or anybody
Mhm.
hearing me or anything like that. To me, I find that to be incredible.
Yeah. Oh, yes. The accessibility is so much. And I think I can't necessarily speak for the entire world of like psychotherapy and coaching and just all of that, but I do think there was a huge shift during COVID when everybody was learning to work from home, and there were so
Yeah.
many professions that
Hmm.
realized, oh, actually, that we actually can do this remotely and still do it well, do it
Right.
ethically, do it competently. And
Hmm.
honest, so that in a sense, it's I think professionally, it's very convenient and accessible, but also I can also speak for a number of folks I've worked with, just generally, that it's can be less intimidating than driving into the city, finding where
Yeah.
the hell is this office in this medical business
Yes.
park, going in and talking to,
Hmm.
someone at the front desk. Oh, I'm here to see so and so. Okay, have a seat. And a bunch of other people. So it's just the
Yeah.
whole, typical community mental health agency experience
Yeah.
is just cut out.
Hmm.
Like, you don't have to deal with that.
Hmm.
You can literally show up on your computer in a hoodie, and that's okay.
It's funny like that you bring that up because I have always wanted to go exclusively online and I kind of had a timetable set up for that and then the pandemic happened and like you've probably gathered all of my clients are trauma clients. It was so interesting to watch that shift, like just the decrease of stress that people were feeling even coming into session of not having to move through traffic and find parking and get up to the
Mhm.
office on time and giving up way more than just 1 hour. We're talking like that's a 3 hour process, like to go to therapy,
Yeah.
because you've got everything before and after. And so I watched their whole nervous system kind of come down to this place of like regulation. And then there was a point where I was going to transition back into my office space. I was leaving, like you could meet in person or online. I didn't care about that. But every single one of my clients asked me to not go back to the office. They were like, "Would you please just consider doing online? I don't want to come back into the office." And that wasn't against me. They were like, "I miss you. I want to see you." But like
Yeah.
being able to be in a space that feels safe to me or to go, I walked with many clients outside. We'd be on the phone and we'd talk and we'd both be walking in a regulating way. They were like, that was just so impactful for me that
Yeah.
I would love to keep doing that. And so I love that. I think it's a really incredible thing.
Yeah.
And I would say too, most coaching is in a video or phone format. Whereas therapy can be that too. But that's
Mhm.
where it's more typically going to be in office. And
Mhm.
then psychiatry is more than not going to be in person, though
Mhm.
sometimes like I see my psychiatric nurse practitioner online. Um,
Yeah.
and then with the psychologist and when we're talking about testing and stuff, that's kind of going to be a 50-50 thing, but mostly in office because they're
Yeah.
oftentimes observing other things rather than just like a battery of, questions that you're asking.
Yeah. Depends on the
Mhm.
testing, I think, but yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a good point.
Yeah. And one other thing that I wanted to say too is we're talking about like what are some of the benefits and things like that. So obviously coaches and therapists do not prescribe medicine. So I think that's really
Correct.
important,
Correct, yes.
right? And so if you have a coach or a therapist who is prescribing medicine, if are not a psychiatric nurse practitioner or a doctor of some sort, run away.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's really important. But I think maybe we should, before we wrap things up, it could be interesting to have a conversation about, is medicine important? when we're healing from trauma,
Mm.
especially for those of
Yeah.
us coming out of religious spaces that really vilified the use of medicine or anything not quote unquote natural to help with mental health issues. So I'm curious to know what did you learn? Like when you were growing up, like kind of what was the perspective that you were taught about medicine, like psychiatric medicine, or what would be called psychotropic medicine?
Right. Well, what I learned growing up was that, if you actually, you had a strong walk with God and you were doing everything that you should
Hmm.
be doing, like in terms of health and
Hmm.
lifestyle. Adventists are very big on that as well.
Yeah.
Health,
Yeah.
like the health message. Um, yeah, then you wouldn't need it. And so definitely when
Yes.
somebody like in the family was like on antidepressants, which
Mm,
antidepressants, like that's one of the most commonly prescribed, like not a big deal. Okay. But like
mm,
it was like, hushed whispers about,
yeah.
oh, they're on antidepressants.
Hmm.
Kind of like that knowing side eye glance, oh boy,
Yep.
obviously there's some unconfessed sin, or
Yes.
and it wasn't explicitly stated, but oh my God,
Mm,
yeah, it was very much looked
yeah.
down upon. It was very much
Yes.
looked down upon, that
Yeah. Huge
there was
stigma.
moral failure
Yeah. Yeah.
attached to that if you were taking
Hmm.
medication for mental health reasons.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I very much agree. Huge stigma. I think the only time that it was ever like not quite as stigmatized was maybe like ADD or ADHD. Like there was
Mhm.
like, at least how I grew up, like a slight recognition that, oh, maybe you need something to help you with that. But even then,
Mhm.
it was like,
Yeah.
can we look at that as like a last resort? Um,
Oh yeah, still a
yeah.
still looked upon as like, ideally
Mhm.
don't do that. But if you have
Yeah.
to, but
Yeah.
I'll be honest though,
Yeah.
even in that context, and of course, even though I was Adventist, we still had the influence of James Dobson, focus on the family
Yes.
crap, and I will call it crap.
Yeah.
Where yeah, where even amongst the circles I grew up in, there was still kind of this idea that like, does he really need Ritalin, or does he just need to have his ass whooped?
Right.
That type of
Right.
mentality. So it's
Yes.
kind of like,
Yep.
honestly,
Hmm.
it was still pretty stigmatized.
Yeah. I know the first time I ever went on to medication was shortly after I started. Well, I think I said in this episode, earlier in this episode, or maybe the last episode, I talked a bit about panic attacks. And for a while, I had no
Mm,
idea what that was.
mhm,
I know that in religion, like before leaving, I had extreme anxiety, like that religious scrupulosity, which we might call like religious OCD.
mhm.
I probably should have been like diagnosed with clinical depression. And all of those were handled in such a way of trust God more.
Mhm.
This is unconfessed sin. You just need to read your Bible more, pray more, do more of like the spiritual practices and those sorts of things, which
Yeah.
like just grieves me, like thinking back 20, 25 years. I'm just like, wow. It just, I just feel sad for my younger
Yeah.
self because there was part of me, like, I remember when I finally told somebody, I think I'm depressed. And I know how much courage it took to say that. And then to think back to what their response was back to me. And it was like, Christians don't get depressed. You just need to trust God more. And like, that just shuts people down. And so it does so much more damage. And so it wasn't until, I was probably, oh gosh, it was probably almost 30 was the first time that I used any sort of psychotropic medication. And it was a result of having panic attacks. And
Mhm.
the person I was working with was a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And she was so funny. She's like, well, you're a therapist. What do you want to take? And I was like, oh my gosh, like, oh, I can take whatever. No. So I was like, give me a couple suggestions and I'll pick from there. And I just remember like being like, oh, wow, it's so nice to feel normal. Like it's so nice to not constantly be on edge. And, my goal in that setting was not to take medicine for the rest of my life, but I recognized how essential it was to
Mhm.
be able to manage the rest of everything. And so there was a
Yeah.
period of years where I kind of went off and on various like anti-anxiety or antidepressants. Some of them worked really well, some of them didn't. There's a lot of experiences of, like symptoms that come with psychiatric medication, which is not
Yeah.
particularly fun to deal with. And then there was a period of time where I was off of medication for a while. And then a few years ago, I got back onto some different kinds of medication, just an extreme amount of stress.
Mhm.
And there's one medication in particular, because I should say this too. There is not really any medication that specifically addresses things like PTSD or CPTSD. When we talk about being on medication for trauma, we're typically talking about medication for the symptoms of trauma. So that might be
Right.
anxiety, depression, things like that. And so anyways, my psychiatric nurse practitioner, who's also a therapist, is like one of my favorite people ever. And she was like, well, there is this medication that's really helping with the nervous system and helps, keep your brain online instead of, being constantly activated. And I tried it, and I remember telling her once, I was like, please don't ever stop writing me prescriptions for this. This is literally the best thing that has ever happened to me. And I've done a lot of trauma resolution work. I'm very, very proud of the work that I've done. And I also never, ever want to not be on propranolol, because that is the thing, like, I can go one day without it, and then my whole entire nervous system feels it. And I have no shame in saying, like, yep, I've done all the work that I'm supposed to do, and I still need this bit of support. And that's how I look at it. It's a support.
Mhm.
It is one of the tools that I have in my toolbox that helps me navigate life and relationships in such a way that allows me to be healthy. And so I am not ashamed of that
Mhm.
at all. And so I know that was like a little soapbox of like medicine stuff, but I think it's a long distance from where I came.
Yeah. Well, no, I'll just echo that. Like, I do not look at, I do not look at medications being like, oh, it's only a last resort thing when you
No.
have to do your due
Yeah.
diligence and exhaust every option and
Hmm.
no, sometimes it's absolutely necessary. It's appropriate, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a shame piece where, well, as long as you try to do something else first, and that's when,
Mm-mm-mm.
like
Yeah.
when I was diagnosed with ADHD, like I went on a medication for that. I think was on an
Mhm.
antidepressant too, because they wanted to start with the one before they went to the other. But
Right. Right.
and yeah, and it worked wonders. I was
Yeah.
like, wow, is this what it feels like to, I don't
Be
know,
normal.
exist in the world and not have
Yeah.
unmedicated ADHD? Like, I mean, because
Yes.
up until that point, that was my normal, and
Yes.
it was just
Yes.
amazing to realize how
Yeah.
much less bandwidth just daily
Yeah.
life was taking up. And so it's like when I work with someone who's like concerned about that, not that I'm prescribing them, but like they'll just ask, like,
Hmm.
do you think I should go get a second opinion from so and so, like a psych appointment or something? And I'm like, well, if you're
Hmm.
interested in that route, yeah,
Yeah.
talk to a professional who
Yeah.
can actually
Yeah.
prescribe it.
Yep. Yep.
Sometimes just for accessibility reasons, like if you have like a your PCP, like they can refer you to a psychiatrist oftentimes.
Yep.
Sometimes
Yep.
then what, because psych appointments are expensive usually, hopefully insurance can help.
Yes.
But then
Hmm.
sometimes what can happen, depending on what it is, the psychiatrist can then, like, if you need a more specialized diagnosis, like you really want to know for sure, do I have ADHD or what's going on here?
Hmm.
The psychiatrist can help, and then they can start with that, medication regimen, and then they can kind of refer back to the PCP, and the PCP will take
Yes.
their professional word for it.
Yep.
Like, okay, I will
Yep.
then continue the script for you, but but they maybe
Yeah.
weren't in a place where they were going to do the testing
Yep.
themselves. That the
Hmm.
PCP, that is.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's different ways to go
Yeah.
about it, but if it's something you think would be helpful,
Yes.
definitely ask.
And that, that speaks to like that when we talked about like the limitations around scope of practice. So when
Mhm.
you can have a therapist or a coach who says, like, this isn't my area of expertise. I can't tell you should go ask for this medicine or that medicine or
Mhm.
whatever. But hey, let's look for somebody in your area or on your insurance panel that can do this for you. I think that also
Mhm.
speaks
Yeah.
highly because there's this recognition of like, yeah, this person would really benefit from some extra support.
Yeah.
And also, I'm saying, maybe I'm saying this for my own benefit. So I do have a PhD. I have some special certifications within that. I can make recommendations about supplements to take
Mm.
that some people like to go a supplement route instead of medication route. However, if you ask my clients or if they're listening, they'll laugh. They'll be like, yes, she says this all the time. I will say, I am not a medical doctor, and I need you to check with your doctor to see how this supplement might interact with this other medication that you're taking. And if the doctor says, okay, go for it, then there you go. You could maybe check into this.
Mhm.
So again, we're looking for people that are like aware of their limitations
Yes.
and not making professional recommendations in
Yes.
areas that they should not be making them. So I know we're almost coming up on at the end of this episode. One thing I wanted to have one final little conversation about that I briefly mentioned is that is the piece of like medicine and trauma, because I made this comment that there is no like PTSD medication specifically for that there or CPTSD. And one of the biggest frustrations I know that I experience, and I've had many clients experiences too, is going, I was diagnosed with depression and OCD and anxiety and this and this and this. So I'm taking this antidepressant, this anxiety, and they work for a little bit and then they don't work. And like what does that actually mean? And so first of all, every body is going to be different in terms of what works for them and what doesn't. So it may be that, you have PTSD, CPTSD, and there's an antidepressant that your body really absorbs well or metabolizes well, and it works, and it really is able to work with the symptoms in a way that feels productive and helpful for you. But there are a great many people who go, the biggest frustration is that I start a medication, it works for 6, 8, 12 weeks, and then I feel like my symptoms come back. And I think what I want to talk about, and I mean, Andrew, you can go in a different direction with this, is like the importance of being able to combine services. So, you don't have to take medicine. You don't have to go to therapy. You don't have to go to coaching, but oftentimes these things work in tandem with one another. So I know from my own personal experience, and I've experienced with clients as well, that maybe they get onto a specific medication, and then they also look at doing some trauma resolution work. And they notice that as they resolve the trauma, not only is this medication working, but the symptoms are resolving in a different way. And maybe that means down the line, they look at weaning themselves off of the medication. Maybe it doesn't. That's not actually my goal. But I think that's important to recognize that because trauma, the way that it impacts the body, it can be really frustrating to go through a process of trying to get on medicine and find something that's truly helpful. So I just want to encourage people with that too. Like it is often necessary to combine a support service with medicine.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, like psychiatry services without any therapeutic or coaching services, it can help, but it can sometimes, I do think doing both. And also for those of you who are into evidence-based research, I mean, the research also says that both has the best outcomes long-term. So,
right.
I do think that that's incredibly helpful to do that. There was something else I was going to say to that too. Just what you said about like your goal is not necessarily to wean them off of medication down the line if they want to.
Right.
And kind of that just ties into, I think I don't remember honestly at this point if this was this episode or another episode, but that I've said this on. But it's like I'm so about personal autonomy. It's kind of like if you want to get off the medication and that's important to you, then we can explore that. If you don't want to, you're free to choose that too. It is literally your prerogative to choose.
Absolutely.
I'm not, doing this with like I have some kind of like a means to an end, like there's a goal and this is what I'm trying to, like, no, it's what you want to do, and you can change your mind as many times as you need to. But really it's about the person's autonomy, the client's autonomy is what's so important. But to the original question, I think if you can't do it, I definitely think having multiple different services can be incredibly beneficial.
Yeah. Well, I know this conversation is maybe different than some of the other episodes, but we really felt like it was important to be able to have a conversation like this, because I know like this is a question I get a lot. I know, like we talked about in social media spaces, there's a lot of people who will say you must go to therapy. Don't go to coaches, only go to coaches, don't go to therapy. Like you have to get on medicine. Definitely don't get on medicine, drink green juice. Like there's so many messages. And I think coming out of high control systems, whether that's a religion, a cult, family, whatever it is, like there's just it can be very confusing. There can be that overwhelming, like, I know I need to get help, but I don't know where to even start.
Mhm.
And I don't know what is what. And I'm also battling some internalized resistance towards any sort of support services because of how they've been truly demonized in the past. And I guess if I had to kind of end this with anything, it's that, like, needing support, wanting support does not make you a weak person, does not make you a sinner. It does not make you, something wrong with you, or that you've got demons or you're possessed or anything like that. I really think it is the strong people that reach out for support, the people that say, hey, there's something going on and I don't know what to do about it, but I am going to try to find somebody who might be able to walk alongside me in this. And I just think it takes a very strong and brave person to do that. And that's not to say if you don't do that, that you're not strong or brave, but I just want to, like, reframe that message that so many of us have been
Mhm.
given within religion, that it's the people that don't trust God, or the people that, don't have enough faith. And that is certainly not the case. It is very strong people that end up
Mhm.
in my office, and probably yours too.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, definitely. It's interesting. I kind of do that, a similar reframe. I might have
Mm,
somebody sitting across from me saying how, like, they just, like, they just feel like they're not doing anything right. They feel like everything's just
mm,
been regressing, and I'll just reframe it like, well, it took a tremendous amount of courage to even be
yeah.
here in the first place, to be
Mhm.
engaging with me in the first place, to wake up this morning, acknowledge I feel like shit. I want to cancel,
Mm,
but I'm not going to cancel. And here I am.
yeah, that's
Like,
huge.
yeah, that takes a lot of courage and a ton of vulnerability. And, like, that
Mm,
is, and I, that, and just being able to put voice to that, and,
yeah,
and show up,
yeah.
that's something like that is the
Mhm.
work, as they say,
Mhm. Mhm.
and so,
Yeah.
yes, I have a tremendous amount of respect for
Yes.
all of my clients.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think my clients are some of the bravest, most fabulous people I've ever met.
Yes.
And it's a huge honor to be able to work with every single one of them. Like, it is a very extreme privilege.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
So as we end this, just curious to know, if we were to offer some resources of where people could find different types of support services. I have a couple in mind, but you know, any that are coming to mind for you.
Okay, so the reality is, if you Google anything related to therapy, you're going to come across Psychology Today, which
Yes.
is fine.
Mhm.
I know some folks don't like them. They have their place, though. They're very accessible. They will always pop up
Yes.
on a Google search.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I will specifically list another one, that there's another database. It's a therapy database, but it is exclusively sliding scale rates, and that's called
Yes.
Open Path
Yes.
Psychotherapy Collective.
Mhm.
I actually,
Mhm.
I can't say I know him, no, but I know of the guy personally. He's from Asheville, which is where I went to
Mhm.
grad school, who created that, and it's kind of taken off. I
Mm.
think the way that it works now is there is an initial membership fee, but once you do
Mhm.
that and you are in the collective, or whatever you want to call it,
Yep.
then you have access to all of these different therapists. And I have searched out of curiosity, because sometimes you'll have a new database that where it's like they
Mhm.
say, oh yeah, national, but then you search Montana and there's like two people in the state.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
they do actually seem to have a pretty good concentration of clinicians all across the
Yep.
country, even in
Mhm.
less populated areas. I've just searched for
Mhm.
fun just to see if that's true, and it seems to be. And
Yeah.
that's a really good resource if you, say, want to do therapy but don't really have the resources to be doing full fee private
Yep.
pay with some folks. Like, that's Open Path Psychotherapy Collective is a really good one that I'll recommend.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think those are both great resources specifically for religious trauma. I'll mention the Reclamation Collective
Mm.
has a therapist directory. Similar to what Andrew was talking about, this is one where, like, it may only be one or two therapists in a state. Luckily, how things are now, especially because of the pandemic, most therapists do understand and take online clients.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
if you live in the state and that they are licensed in, Typically, you can get sessions with them and your insurance would cover it. That's the biggest thing. With insurance, you do have to see a provider in your state. And I know that I'm not sure by the time this episode comes out, I'm not sure if the Religious Trauma Institute will have their directory out, but they are also doing something similar. And of course, I'm going to plug the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery in two ways. First of all, if you go to our resources page, there is actually a large list of therapy directories that we have on there that we try to update regularly. And that's going to just give you a variety of different resources. We don't claim that they are religious trauma informed, but most of them are very trauma informed and have practitioners that do understand trauma resolution. So please feel free to, if you go to just traumaresolutionandrecovery.com and click the resources button, there's a tab that says recommended resources. And on there, I think there's like 10 different therapy directories that you could potentially find a practitioner in your area that would accept your insurance. So of course, I want to make sure that people are aware of that. And then Andrew and I've talked about, the fact that we work as practitioners for the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and we offer coaching services. We want to be very clear about that. So that can impact people, especially if we're talking about payment and insurance and things like that. The nice part about it, of course, is that we are accessible to anybody in the US or the entire world. And all of our practitioners not only understand religious trauma cognitively, we all understand it from our own personal experiences, as well as have pursued additional trainings and understanding of how to resolve trauma in the body, and then specifically recovering from religious trauma. So our hope is that, with some of these resources that we've mentioned, that if you're looking for support, you would be able to find something that fits your budget and your area and what you're looking for. All right. Okay. Let's do a quick Taking Back Sundays.
So what this is a Star Wars model kit.
I love it.
Of a speeder bike. It's a speeder bike from, Return of the Jedi. The backstory to this is that, another backstory real quick. A lot of my own personal work right now is not just as a practitioner, but also as a client myself, is doing internal family systems and parts work and stuff.
Yeah.
And so some of what I'm doing is some of that, inner child work would be what some of y'all would know what I'm saying, kind of talking about when I reference that. So that particular model, way back when I was a kid, I think it was 99. I don't remember. But anyway, one of those Christmases, our house was actually broken into. And that was one of the things that was stolen. And, it was one of those presents where Christmas hadn't come yet, but I knew I was getting it because I saw it in the store and my mom was like, well, I'll get it for you for Christmas type of thing back in November or something. Anyway, it's been one of those things where I've always remembered that so specifically, but never really. I think after that had happened, my mom went back to the same store, tried to find the same set, but they were sold out. And I decided, you know what, I'm gonna go look and see if I can find that same one. It's the same brand and everything. I wasn't sure I'd be able to find it because that's literally the 20th, and it was released in 97, which was the 20th anniversary of the initial movie releases. So it's not easy to find, but I found a guy on eBay who was selling them still sealed.
Oh my gosh.
Actually sealed. So
that's incredible. Oh my gosh.
I found it.
We're taking that back. Hell yes. Yeah. I love it.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that makes my heart so happy for you. I'm so excited. So you're going to build it?
Yes, I am. As I'm looking at it, It requires glue and it's not just a snap together model. It's an actual model. Okay. So I'll need to get some other materials to do it appropriately and such, which I'll do that.
Okay.
But
okay. Well, I think you're going to need to post a picture of that once you're done, because I think that is so cool. I love the reclamation process of those are such pivotal, important moments for us to have. And I always think it's so funny because I always feel like we're on similar wavelengths, with different things that we're taking back. Cause I know I mentioned this at the front of the episode. I was like, what am I reclaiming? Oh, it's these lighter moments. So, I was talking about having these contrasting times of my day listening to the Bachelor podcast. So I'm in the yuck stuff and then I'm in the light stuff and, kind of oscillating back and forth. And I think that that's something that I'm trying to do is taking back lighter moments in the sense that I think when I was in religion and often in the thick of my trauma healing work, everything just felt really heavy. There wasn't a lot of room for play and
Mhm.
lightness and ease. And I really am trying to give those moments to myself, to, whether it's like simply just, standing outside or, like doing something that I, you know, like you did when I was a kid. Right. And so yeah, I don't have specific, like it's these 5 activities that I'm doing, but it's giving myself, like, noticing, okay, I've been in the dark, deep spaces for a while today. Like, what can I do to kind of give myself like moments of ease? And so, like, even last night, it was like, I'm gonna take a bath, which is not always my favorite thing to do, and sometimes seems really pointless, like a waste of time to just sit there and be like, oh, okay. But it was like this moment of lightness that, like, was so necessary.
Yeah.
So yeah, like finding those moments of lightness and ease, just to contrast the heaviness of the day to day, whether that's with my own personal work, client work, everything that's going on in the world. Like that, it feels really important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today and this lovely episode talking about all the fun things of therapy and psychiatry and coaching. Um I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Bye.